Mobile, Alabama, October 18, 1981. The congregation of Riverside Baptist Church had never seen their pulpit empty on a Sunday morning. For 12 years, Pastor Thomas Mitchell had stood behind that worn wooden podium at exactly 10:30 a.m., his deep voice carrying the word of God through the humid Alabama air. But on this particular October morning, as the autumn sun filtered through the stained glass windows depicting scenes from the Gospel of Matthew, only silence filled the sanctuary. Margaret Wells, the church secretary, adjusted her glasses nervously as she watched the crowd of nearly 200 parishioners shuffle in their pews. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked past 10:35, then 10:40. Still no sign of Pastor Mitchell. The scent of fresh magnolias from the church garden mixed with the familiar smell of old hymnals and polished wood, creating an atmosphere that should have been comforting but now felt unsettling. Pastor Thomas Mitchell was a creature of unwavering routine. At 43 years old, he had built his entire life around precision and dedication. Every weekday at 6 a.m., he could be found jogging along the Mobile Bay waterfront, his grey New Balance sneakers pounding against the concrete as shrimp boats prepared for their daily voyage. By 7:30, he was at Mel's Diner on Government Street, ordering the same breakfast: 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast and black coffee. The waitresses knew him by name, and he knew theirs. His modest ranch house on Hillcrest Road reflected the same methodical nature. Everything had its place: sermon notes organized by date in manila folders, theological books arranged alphabetically on handmade shelves, and a small garden where he grew tomatoes and bell peppers with the patience of someone who understood that good things took time. But it wasn't just his reliability that made Pastor Mitchell beloved in the community. During the devastating Hurricane Frederick in 1979, he had opened the church doors to families who had lost their homes, sleeping on a cot in his office for 3 weeks while coordinating relief efforts. When the Riverside neighborhood faced economic hardship as the local shipyard laid off workers, he had quietly used church funds to help families pay their electricity bills, never asking for recognition. The last person to see Pastor Mitchell was his neighbor, Mrs. Dorothy Crane, an 82-year-old widow who lived in the house next door. She had waved to him from her kitchen window on Saturday evening as he watered his garden. He had waved back, that familiar, gentle smile crossing his face as he called out, "See you in church tomorrow, Mrs. Crane." She had gone to bed that night expecting nothing more than another peaceful Sunday in their quiet neighborhood. When Margaret Wells called the pastor's house at 10:45 a.m., the phone rang endlessly. The sound echoed through his empty kitchen, past the coffee pot that hadn't been turned on, past the newspaper still wrapped in plastic on his front porch. His 1978 Buick LeSabre sat in the driveway, keys hanging on the hook by the front door, church clothes laid out on his bed as if he had simply vanished while preparing for the morning service. The congregation waited until 11:15 before Margaret made the announcement that would change everything. Standing at the pulpit where Pastor Mitchell should have been, her voice trembling slightly, she said, "I'm afraid Pastor Mitchell seems to be unwell this morning. Let us pray for his swift recovery and dismiss early today." But Margaret Wells knew this wasn't about illness. In 12 years, Thomas Mitchell had never missed a Sunday service, not even when he had walking pneumonia in 1977. Something was terribly wrong, as the confused parishioners filed out of the church, whispering among themselves. None of them could imagine that this would be the beginning of a mystery that would haunt Mobile for decades. The man who had dedicated his life to providing answers about faith and salvation had become a question with no answer, a puzzle that would test the limits of human understanding and community bonds. The autumn wind rustled through the oak trees surrounding the church, carrying with it the first hint that nothing in Riverside would ever be quite the same again. Mobile, Alabama, October 19, 1981. Detective Ray Hutchinson had worked missing persons cases for 8 years, but something about the Thomas Mitchell disappearance felt different from the moment he stepped into the pastor's house. The front door had been unlocked, which Mrs. Crane confirmed was unusual. Pastor Mitchell was cautious about security, always checking his locks twice before bed. The house told a story of interrupted routine. In the kitchen, a half-eaten bowl of cornflakes sat on the table, the milk now sour and curdled. The morning newspaper lay unopened beside it, still damp from the early morning dew. His coffee pot was clean and empty, though Mrs. Crane insisted she had smelled coffee brewing around 7 a.m. while she was feeding her cats on the back porch. Detective Hutchinson walked through each room methodically, his experienced eyes cataloguing every detail. In the bedroom, Pastor Mitchell's Sunday suit hung pressed and ready on the closet door, navy blue with a conservative red tie that he wore for special occasions. His Bible, leather-worn from years of use, sat open on the nightstand to Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd." A half-finished sermon about forgiveness lay on his desk, the last sentence trailing off mid-thought. "We must remember that even in our darkest moments, redemption is—" The pastor's wallet remained on his dresser, containing $47 in cash and all his identification. His watch, a simple Timex that had been a gift from the congregation on his 10th anniversary, sat beside it. These weren't the actions of someone planning to leave voluntarily. Margaret Wells organized the first search party on Tuesday morning. Word spread quickly through the tight-knit community, and by 9 a.m., over 100 volunteers had gathered in the church parking lot. The group included members from other congregations, local business owners, and even some folks who rarely attended church but respected the pastor's work in the community. They searched every inch of the neighborhood surrounding Hillcrest Road. Volunteers walked through the nearby Brookley Industrial Complex, calling Pastor Mitchell's name until their voices grew hoarse. They combed through the dense woods behind the Mobile River, where the Spanish moss hung like curtains, and the ground was soft with decades of fallen leaves. Search dogs were brought in from Montgomery, but they lost the scent at the end of Pastor Mitchell's driveway, as if he had simply vanished into thin air. The Mobile Police Department treated the case seriously from the beginning. Captain Frank Morrison, a member of First Methodist Church downtown, understood the impact Pastor Mitchell had on the community. They interviewed everyone who had contact with the pastor in the days leading up to his disappearance. Sarah Jenkins, who ran the church's food pantry, remembered their last conversation on Friday afternoon. "Pastor Mitchell seemed tired," she told Detective Hutchinson. "He mentioned that he'd been having trouble sleeping, kept saying he was wrestling with something, but when I asked what was bothering him, he just smiled and said, 'Nothing that prayer can't handle, Sarah.'" The investigation revealed that Pastor Mitchell had received several phone calls the week before his disappearance. Margaret Wells found notations in his appointment book that simply read, "TK, important," for Tuesday and Thursday evenings. No one at the church knew who TK was, and the pastor hadn't mentioned expecting any visitors. As days turned into weeks, the initial energy of the search began to fade. The volunteers still came, but in smaller numbers. The prayer vigils continued every evening at the church, but the desperate hope in people's voices gradually gave way to a resigned sadness. Missing person flyers with Pastor Mitchell's photograph, showing his kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and his gentle smile, were posted throughout Mobile County, from gas stations to grocery stores. Mrs. Crane stopped sleeping well. Every night, she would look out her bedroom window toward the pastor's dark house, hoping to see a light come on, hoping to see his familiar silhouette moving through the rooms. She had taken to leaving her porch light on all night, just in case he came home and needed to see his way to the door. The church struggled to continue without their beloved pastor. Guest ministers filled the pulpit each Sunday, but it wasn't the same. The congregation missed Pastor Mitchell's personal touch, the way he remembered everyone's names, their children's birthdays, their struggles and celebrations. They missed his thoughtful sermons that connected biblical teachings to their daily lives in Mobile, whether they worked at the shipyard, the paper mill, or the downtown offices. By Christmas of 1981, the investigation had gone cold. Detective Hutchinson had followed every lead, interviewed every person connected to Pastor Mitchell, and found nothing that explained his disappearance. The case remained open, but active searching had stopped. The Mobile Police Department had other cases that demanded their attention, and the pastor's file was moved to a cabinet with other unsolved mysteries. The last entry in Detective Hutchinson's case notes, dated December 23, 1981, read, "No evidence of foul play, no evidence of voluntary departure. Subject appears to have vanished without explanation. Case remains open, pending new information." But in the quiet neighborhoods of Mobile, people didn't forget. They continued to wonder, to theorize, to hope. And somewhere in the back of everyone's mind was the uncomfortable question that no one wanted to voice. If a man of God could disappear without a trace, what did that say about the safety of their small southern community? Mobile, Alabama, 1985 to 1995. 4 years after Pastor Mitchell's disappearance, Riverside Baptist Church finally called a new permanent pastor. Reverend David Tompkins was a young man from Mississippi with an earnest demeanor and a passion for community outreach. but he could never quite fill the void left by Thomas Mitchell. The congregation tried their best to move forward, but the empty space in their hearts remained. Mrs. Dorothy Crane, now 86, had become the unofficial keeper of Pastor Mitchell's memory. She maintained his garden with the help of neighborhood children, keeping his tomato plants alive year after year as if he might return to harvest them. The house itself had been left exactly as it was, with the church board paying the utilities and basic maintenance, just until we know for certain, Margaret Wells would say, though everyone understood that certainty might never come. Detective Ray Hutchinson retired in 1988, but he never stopped thinking about the case. He had investigated dozens of missing persons over his career, but Pastor Mitchell haunted him in a way the others didn't. Perhaps it was because there were no answers, no closure, no sense of justice served. He kept a copy of the case file in his home office, reviewing it occasionally when sleep wouldn't come, searching for the detail he might have missed. The theories in the community evolved over time. Some believed Pastor Mitchell had suffered a medical emergency while walking and had fallen into the Mobile River, his body carried out to Mobile Bay by the current. Others suspected he had been the victim of a random crime, though no evidence ever supported this. A few whispered that he might have left voluntarily, overwhelmed by some personal crisis, but those who knew him best rejected this possibility entirely. In 1992, a homeless man found some clothing along the riverbank that briefly raised hopes. The items included a navy blue suit jacket that looked similar to what Pastor Mitchell might have worn, but forensic testing proved it wasn't his. The false alarm reopened wounds that had never fully healed and reminded the community that they were still living with an unsolved mystery. Sarah Jenkins, now in her 60s and still running the church food pantry, had developed her own routine of remembrance. Every October 18th, she would place fresh flowers on the empty chair where Pastor Mitchell used to sit during church meetings. "He's still our pastor," she would tell newcomers who asked about the extra chair. "He's just away for a while." The pastor's disappearance had affected the entire community in ways both subtle and profound. Parents held their children a little closer, neighbors checked on each other more frequently, and everyone was more aware of how quickly a normal day could turn into a nightmare. The case had shown them that even in their peaceful corner of Alabama, inexplicable things could happen to good people. Margaret Wells, who had become the church's administrative director, kept a detailed file of every tip and lead that came in over the years. There weren't many, a handful of supposed sightings in other states, a few crank calls, and one letter from a woman in California who claimed Pastor Mitchell was living under an assumed name in her neighborhood. Each lead was investigated and ultimately proven false, but Margaret documented everything with the meticulous care of someone who believed that someday, somehow, they would need that information. The physical search efforts had long since ended, but the emotional searching continued. Church members would find themselves scanning crowds at the grocery store or at football games, always hoping to catch a glimpse of that familiar face. Mrs. Crane continued her evening vigil at the window, though she now used a magnifying glass to see clearly across the yard. In 1994, the Mobile Police Department underwent a major reorganization, and many old case files were transferred to new storage facilities. Detective Maria Santos, a recent transfer from Birmingham, was assigned to review cold cases and found herself drawn to the Pastor Mitchell file. She spent several weeks rereading witness statements and evidence reports, but like Detective Hutchinson before her, she found no new angles to pursue. By 1995, 14 years had passed since Pastor Mitchell's disappearance. Many of the original congregation members had moved away, passed away, or transferred to other churches. Riverside Baptist had adapted to life without their beloved pastor, but his memory remained woven into the fabric of their community identity. The church had established the Thomas Mitchell Memorial Fund, which provided assistance to families facing financial hardship. Every Christmas, they distributed food baskets in his honor. Every summer, they organized a community garden project, planting tomatoes and bell peppers, just like the ones he had grown in his backyard. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Pastor Mitchell's disappearance was the way it had taught the community about the fragility of life and the importance of cherishing each day. His empty pulpit had become a silent sermon about love, loss, and the enduring power of faith in the face of unanswered questions. As 1995 drew to a close, Mrs. Crane celebrated her 96th birthday with a small party organized by the church ladies. As she blew out the candles on her cake, Several people noticed her glance toward the window that faced Pastor Mitchell's house, as if she was making a wish that everyone understood, but no one spoke aloud. The mystery remained, but the love and respect for Pastor Thomas Mitchell had only grown stronger with time. His disappearance had become part of Mobile's history, a story that parents told their children, a reminder that some questions don't have easy answers, and that sometimes the most important thing is simply to keep caring, keep hoping, and keep the memory of good people alive in our hearts. Mobile, Alabama, March 12, 2004. 23 years after Pastor Mitchell's disappearance, the old Riverside Shopping Center was finally being demolished to make way for a new medical complex. The shopping center had been built in 1963 and had thrived through the 1970s, but by the 1990s, most of the stores had closed as newer shopping areas drew customers away. For the past decade, it had stood mostly empty, its parking lot cracked and overgrown with weeds. Construction foreman Billy Watkins was supervising the demolition of the old Woolworth store when his crew made a discovery that would send shockwaves through Mobile. As the heavy machinery tore through a storage room in the back of the building, workers noticed something unusual embedded in the concrete foundation. "Hold up," Billy called out to the operator of the excavator. He cut the engine for a minute. In the sudden silence that followed, Billy climbed down into the partially demolished foundation to get a better look. Partially encased in what appeared to be hastily poured concrete was a metal object that looked distinctly out of place. After carefully chipping away some of the concrete with hand tools, Billy realized he was looking at a briefcase. The briefcase was old-fashioned, made of brown leather that had been preserved remarkably well by the concrete. More importantly, there was a brass nameplate on the handle that made Billy's blood run cold. Rev. Thomas R. Mitchell, Riverside Baptist Church. Billy immediately called the Mobile Police Department. Within an hour, the construction site was swarming with investigators, including Detective Maria Santos, who had taken over the cold case files several years earlier. The briefcase was carefully extracted from the concrete and transported to the police station for examination. Inside the briefcase, investigators found items that painted a disturbing picture of Pastor Mitchell's final days. There were several letters addressed to him, all from the same sender, Terry Kowalski, a former church member who had left Riverside Baptist under controversial circumstances in 1980. The letters grew increasingly angry and threatening as they progressed, accusing Pastor Mitchell of ruining my life and turning my family against me. Also in the briefcase were Pastor Mitchell's appointment book, his wallet, his watch, and most chillingly, his car keys. At the bottom of the briefcase was a note in Pastor Mitchell's handwriting: "Meeting with TK at Old Woolworth Storage Room, 10 p.m. Saturday. Please, Lord, let me find the right words to help this troubled soul." Detective Santos immediately began investigating Terry Kowalski. What she discovered was a man whose life had spiraled out of control after leaving Riverside Baptist. Kowalski had been a respected member of the congregation until 1980, when Pastor Mitchell had confronted him about allegations of financial impropriety in his role as church treasurer. Margaret Wells, now 73 but still sharp as ever, remembered the incident clearly. Terry had been taking money from the building fund, she told Detective Santos. Pastor Mitchell handled it as gently as he could. He didn't press charges, didn't make a public scandal. He just asked Terry to resign quietly and make restitution. But Terry was furious. He felt like Pastor Mitchell had humiliated him. Church records showed that Kowalski had indeed made partial restitution, paying back about $3,000 of the estimated $7,500 he had taken. But according to several church members, he had blamed Pastor Mitchell for his subsequent divorce and the loss of his job at a local insurance company. Detective Santos tracked down Kowalski's last known address and discovered that he had died in 1998 of liver disease, apparently after years of heavy drinking. But his widow, Linda Kowalski, was still living in a mobile home park on the outskirts of Mobile. When Detective Santos arrived at Linda's home on March 15, 2004, she found a 62-year-old woman who looked much older than her years. Linda's hands shook as she invited the detective inside, and before Santos could even explain why she was there, Linda began to speak. "I've been waiting for you to come," Linda said quietly. "For 23 years, I've been waiting for someone to find that briefcase." Over the next several hours, Linda Kowalski told a story that finally provided answers to one of Mobile's most enduring mysteries. Her husband Terry had indeed arranged to meet Pastor Mitchell at the old Woolworth storage room on the night of October 17, 1981. Terry had told her he wanted to have it out with the pastor once and for all. Terry was drinking heavily by then, Linda explained, tears streaming down her face. He blamed Pastor Mitchell for everything that had gone wrong in his life. He couldn't accept that his own actions had consequences. According to Linda, Terry had returned home around midnight that Saturday, visibly shaken and covered in concrete dust. He told her there had been an accident and that Pastor Mitchell was dead. In a panic, Terry had used his connections at a construction company where he had briefly worked to obtain quick-setting concrete, and he had sealed Pastor Mitchell's body in the storage room foundation that very night. I begged him to go to the police, Linda sobbed, but he said no one would believe it was an accident. He said he'd go to prison and our kids would be left with nothing. He made me promise never to tell anyone. Linda's account was that Terry claimed he had only intended to confront Pastor Mitchell, to demand an apology for what he saw as unfair treatment. But when Pastor Mitchell tried to leave the meeting, Terry had grabbed him, and in the struggle that followed, Pastor Mitchell had fallen and struck his head on a concrete block. Terry said he tried to help him, but Pastor Mitchell wouldn't wake up, Linda continued. Terry panicked. He'd been drinking, he was scared, and he made the worst decision of his life. Instead of calling for help, he decided to cover it up. Detective Santos knew that Linda's story would be difficult to verify after so many years, but the physical evidence supported her account. The briefcase had clearly been placed in concrete that was poured hastily and unprofessionally. Construction records from 1981 showed that Terry Kowalski had indeed worked briefly for Martinez Construction, which had contracts for several projects in the area. Most importantly, when investigators returned to the demolition site with ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, they found human remains in the concrete foundation adjacent to where the briefcase had been discovered. Mobile, Alabama, March 20, 2004. The discovery of Pastor Thomas Mitchell's remains sent shockwaves through Mobile that were felt far beyond the Riverside Baptist Church community. After 23 years of wondering, praying, and hoping, the community finally had answers, though they were not the answers anyone had wanted to hear. Dr. Elizabeth Harmon, the state medical examiner, worked carefully to extract and examine Pastor Mitchell's remains. Despite being encased in concrete for over 2 decades, the preservation was remarkable. Dr. Harmon's findings supported Linda Kowalski's account. Pastor Mitchell had died from blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with a fall onto a hard surface. The injury pattern suggests a single impact rather than repeated blows, Dr. Harmon explained to Detective Santos. While I cannot definitively rule out intentional harm, the evidence is consistent with an accidental death during a struggle. The medical examiner's report brought some small comfort to those who had loved Pastor Mitchell. He had not suffered, and there was no evidence of torture or prolonged violence. But for many in the community, this knowledge was overshadowed by the devastating realization that his death could have been prevented if Terry Kowalski had simply called for help instead of choosing to cover up what had happened. Mrs. Dorothy Crane, now 98 years old, received the news while sitting in her living room, surrounded by members of the church who had come to support her. Margaret Wells held her hand as Detective Santos gently explained what they had discovered. Mrs. Crane listened in silence, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. I always knew he wouldn't have left us voluntarily, she whispered. Thomas was not the kind of man to abandon his responsibilities, but I always hoped he was somewhere safe, maybe helping other people. The church held a memorial service on March 25, 2004, exactly 1 week after Pastor Mitchell's remains were found. The service was held in the same sanctuary where he had preached for 12 years, though the building had been renovated twice since 1981. Hundreds of people attended, including many who had moved away from Mobile but returned to pay their respects. Reverend David Tompkins, who had served as Riverside Baptist's pastor for 19 years, delivered a moving eulogy that focused on Pastor Mitchell's life and legacy rather than the circumstances of his death. Thomas Mitchell was a man who believed in redemption, Reverend Tompkins said. He believed that every person, no matter how lost or broken, could find their way back to grace. Even now, in this moment of grief, we must remember that his faith called us to forgiveness. The most powerful moment of the service came when Sarah Jenkins, now 74, read from Pastor Mitchell's unfinished sermon about forgiveness, the one that had been found on his desk in 1981. She read the complete sentence that he had never been able to finish. We must remember that even in our darkest moments, redemption is possible for all of God's children. After the service, Pastor Mitchell was laid to rest in Riverside Cemetery, in a plot donated by the church. His headstone was simple, Rev. Thomas R. Mitchell, 1938-1981, beloved pastor and shepherd. Beneath those words was a verse from the psalm that had been open on his nightstand. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. Detective Santos closed the case file on April 1, 2004. Her final report noted that while Terry Kowalski could not be prosecuted due to his death in 1998, the evidence strongly supported Linda Kowalski's account of events. Linda herself was not charged with any crime, as the statute of limitations for accessory after the fact had long since expired. The church board made the decision to preserve Pastor Mitchell's house as a community center, renamed the Thomas Mitchell Memorial Center. Mrs. Crane, despite her advanced age, insisted on continuing to maintain the garden. Thomas always said that gardens teach us about patience and faith, she told visitors. You plant seeds, you tend them with love, and you trust that something beautiful will grow. Linda Kowalski left Mobile shortly after giving her statement to police. She donated what little money she had to the church's memorial fund and asked that a letter of apology be read at Pastor Mitchell's memorial service. In it, she wrote, "I have carried this secret for 23 years, and it has eaten away at my soul like a cancer. I know that Pastor Mitchell would have forgiven my husband, and I pray that someday the community can find it in their hearts to forgive me for my silence." The impact of Pastor Mitchell's story extended far beyond Mobile. News outlets across the country picked up the story of the missing pastor, whose remains were discovered during a routine demolition. The case became a reminder of how one moment of panic and poor judgment can create ripples of pain that last for decades. For the members of Riverside Baptist Church, the resolution of the mystery brought a complex mix of emotions. There was relief at finally knowing the truth, but also profound sadness at the realization that Pastor Mitchell had died alone in a moment of fear and confusion. There was anger at Terry Kowalski for his cowardice, but also recognition that hatred would dishonor Pastor Mitchell's memory. Margaret Wells, who had kept vigil over the mystery for 23 years, perhaps expressed it best during a television interview. "We lost Thomas twice, once when he disappeared, and again when we learned how he died. But we've also found him twice. We found his memory and all the lives he touched, and now we've found his body so we can properly lay him to rest. That has to be enough." As autumn returned to Mobile in 2004, the leaves began to fall around Pastor Mitchell's grave. Mrs. Crane, now using a walker but still determined, made her weekly visit to tend the flowers planted there. Sometimes she would sit on the small bench beside the headstone and tell him about the church, about how the community center was helping families, about how his garden was still growing strong. On October 18, 2004, exactly 23 years after Pastor Mitchell's disappearance, the church held its first annual Thomas Mitchell Day of Service. Volunteers worked throughout the community, helping elderly residents, cleaning up neighborhoods, and serving meals to those in need. It was, everyone agreed, exactly what Pastor Mitchell would have wanted. His legacy not defined by how he died, but by how he had lived, and how his example continued to inspire others to serve. The 1981 case of the missing pastor from Mobile had finally ended, not with the stunning arrest that many had expected, but with something perhaps more powerful, a community's decision to honor a good man's memory by continuing his work of love, service, and redemption. In the end, that was the most fitting resolution of all,